In May 1945, just days before the war in Europe officially ended, a German U-boat was spotted on the surface in the Kattegat Strait between Denmark and Sweden. RAF Liberator bombers descended. Depth charges tore open its hull while it was still on the surface. The boat went down with 52 men aboard. 49 escaped into the cold water, but 3 died before rescue came. U-534 had been among the last submarines to leave Germany. Every other U-boat in the area was preparing to comply with incoming surrender orders. So, why was this one still running? And what was it carrying that was worth the risk? U-534 left Kiel, Germany on May 2, 1945, when the Reich was in its final days. Berlin had just fallen. Hitler had taken his own life 2 days earlier. Grand Admiral Dönitz, now in command, would issue the general ceasefire and surrender orders within 48 hours. This was a type WWII, a long-range submarine designed for Atlantic patrols, capable of staying submerged for weeks and traveling over 13,000 nautical miles. It was built in 1942 at Deutsche Werft in Hamburg, one of the last of its kind to see active service. Deutsche Werft had produced dozens of these boats during the war, each one a 1,100-ton Predator built to choke Allied supply lines across the Atlantic. The Type 9 series had become the backbone of Germany's long-range submarine operations, designed specifically for extended patrols far from home ports. U-534 measured 76 meters bow to stern, carried a crew of 52 men, and was armed with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward, 2 aft. Its official patrol designation in Kriegsmarine records lists a standard combat mission. But the boat was headed north, toward Scandinavia, not west toward Allied convoy routes where the remaining wolf packs had been operating. The departure itself was unusual. Kiel Harbor in early May 1945 was under constant Allied air surveillance. U-boats leaving port were tracked, targeted, bombed. Most didn't make it past the Danish Straits. U-534 slipped out during a narrow weather window, traveling in a small convoy with 2 other submarines, U-3523 and U-3503. Using shallow coastal waters where diving would be impossible, the crew had been assembled quickly. Some were veterans of multiple patrols. Others were young recruits who'd never seen combat. The captain, Kapitän Leutnant Herbert Nollau, was an experienced officer but not one of the Kriegsmarine's celebrated aces. His service record showed competence, caution, adherence to orders, not the profile of a man who'd defy direct commands from high command. That routing makes no tactical sense for a combat patrol. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Allied air superiority made surface travel dangerous. U-boats across Germany were being prepared for surrender or scuttling. By early May, Dönitz was coordinating the final collapse. Some commanders were already opening seacocks and setting scuttling charges in port. Others were preparing to sail toward Allied-controlled zones with instructions to surrender. U-534's course suggests it wasn't hunting ships. It was moving north with purpose, and the crew knew the risks. 3 days into the voyage, on May 5th, they were caught on the surface in the morning, around 9 or 10 a.m. Submarines in 1945 traveled submerged during the day when possible, surfacing only at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the boat. But U-534 was traveling in shallow waters northeast of Anholt Island, where diving wasn't an option. The keel would hit bottom. They were making a run on the surface at speed, banking on the slim chance they could reach Swedish territorial waters before being intercepted. The diesel engines could push the boat to 18 knots on the surface, far faster than the 7 knots they could manage submerged. Sweden was neutral. A U-boat reaching Swedish waters could claim internment. Crews would sit out the war's end in relative comfort, rather than face Allied captivity. Swedish waters were approximately 20 to 25 nautical miles from where U-534 was spotted. At 18 knots, they needed over an hour. They didn't have it. The RAF attack was swift. Depth charges hit the aft section while the boat was still on the surface. The pressure hull ruptured. Water flooded the engine room and stern compartments. The boat went down. All 52 men initially escaped into the water, but 3 died from injuries or exposure before rescue arrived. But here's what doesn't fit. When the wreck was found decades later, torpedoes were still loaded in the tubes. If this was a combat patrol, why hadn't they engaged targets? If this was an evacuation run, why carry live ordnance at all? U-534 sat undisturbed on the seabed of the Kattegat for 41 years, until a Danish wreck hunter named Ole Madsen found it in 1986 with side-scan sonar. The wreck was lying at 67 meters in cold, low-oxygen water. The Kattegat Strait, connecting the Baltic Sea to the North Sea, is a graveyard for ships and submarines. The water temperature hovers near freezing year-round at depth. Oxygen levels are low enough to inhibit most bacterial decomposition. Silt from the Baltic settles slowly, covering wrecks in fine sediment that acts as a preservative. That environment is a time capsule. The pressure hull was largely intact. The conning tower was upright. The external plating showed blast damage consistent with aerial depth charges. Concave dents, fractures along weld seams, sections peeled back like torn fabric. When divers first descended in the late 1980s, they reported something unusual. The torpedo tubes in the bow were loaded. Live weapons, unfired, sitting in the tubes since May 5, 1945. The warheads were degraded by salt water, but still present. Salvage divers flagged them as hazardous. In 1993, a salvage operation led by Danish businessman Carsten Reich brought the entire submarine to the surface in one piece. The operation was unprecedented. Most U-boat wrecks are left on the seabed or salvaged in sections. The team used massive floating cranes, synchronized lift bags, and weeks of preparation to bring U-534 up intact. What they brought to the surface wasn't just a wreck. It was a sealed archive. Inside the compartments, they found phonograph records, Zara Leander, Johann Strauss II, Bach, Gerhard Husch. These weren't propaganda broadcasts. They were personal records, the kind submariners kept in the crew quarters to break the monotony of weeks underwater. The records were waterlogged but playable after careful conservation. One disc, a recording of Strauss's Tales from the Vienna Woods, still had a crewman's name scratched into the label in pencil. Crew uniforms hung on hooks, some still with personal items in the pockets. Photographs, letters. A pocket watch stopped at a specific time. Canned rations were stacked in the galley, rusted shut but unopened. Documents had been stored in watertight containers in the officers' quarters. Some were sealed so well that papers were still partially legible, though the ink had faded and the paper was brittle. Here's what the forensic evidence tells us. The torpedoes being loaded means the crew was still operating as a combat-ready vessel. They hadn't scuttled. They hadn't surrendered. Standard procedure for a U-boat under orders to surrender was to surface, signal compliance, and either make for an Allied port or await boarding. Scuttling procedure involved opening seacocks, setting demolition charges on sensitive equipment, and ensuring the boat sank in deep water. U-534 did neither. The seacocks were closed. No charges had been set. Sensitive equipment was intact, sitting in operational positions. That's not the signature of a planned scuttling. That's the signature of a boat that went down still operational, with no time for the crew to destroy evidence or secure a controlled evacuation. The presence of personal effects, especially the music records, suggests this wasn't a short-range mission. Submariners didn't carry luxuries unless they expected to be at sea for weeks. Space on a U-boat was brutally limited. Every cubic meter was accounted for. Fuel, torpedoes, food, water, ammunition. Personal items were discouraged unless the mission profile allowed for it. The fact that crewmen had brought phonograph records implies they'd been told or believed this was going to be a long voyage. The rations were German military issue, and the quantity found implies provisions for an extended voyage. A standard Type 1C40 patrol in the Atlantic lasted 8 to 12 weeks. The provisions on U-534, based on salvage inventories, suggested stores for at least that duration. The documents recovered from the officers' quarters were water damaged, but portions were legible after restoration. They included navigational charts that didn't match the official patrol route. Some had annotations in pencil, coordinates, dates scratched out, cryptic notations that didn't correspond to standard Kriegsmarine codes. One chart showed a route extending past Norway, with notations suggesting contingency plans. And then there's what they didn't find. No scuttling charges had been set, no seacocks opened, no demolition protocol initiated. The boat went down still functional, but the charts were annotated with routes that led away from standard combat zones. Where were they planning to go? Official Kriegsmarine manifests list U-534's departure, with standard armament and supplies for a Type 140 on patrol. The wreck told a different story. Salvage teams found extra fuel drums lashed in compartments not designed for them, an indication the boat had been modified for extended range beyond its normal 13,000-mile capability. These weren't standard issue drums. They were civilian containers, repurposed, welded with hasty tack welds that wouldn't pass inspection in a peacetime shipyard. There were additional storage containers welded to interior bulkheads, a retrofit job done hastily, likely in the final weeks before departure. The welding was crude, done quickly, with spatter marks, and incomplete penetration that suggests the work was done under time pressure. Kiel's shipyards in early May 1945 were bombed-out facilities, operating with skeleton crews and scavenged materials. The modifications speak to urgent preparation for a mission that required extended range. Survivor testimony from the 49 crew members who escaped the sinking, taken as POWs by the British in May 1945, was vague and contradictory. Some mentioned special cargo. Others said they were under orders not to discuss the mission. Many claimed they didn't know what the boat was carrying because they were enlisted men working in specific sections who never entered forward compartments. The captain, Herbert Nolau, went down with the boat initially, but was among those who escaped, though he and the executive officer were among the 3 who died before rescue. The survivors who lived were mostly enlisted men and junior petty officers, men who followed orders and didn't ask questions. Their POW interrogation reports, declassified in the 1990s, show Allied intelligence officers pressing them for details about cargo, passengers, or special equipment. The answers were consistent. "I don't know," and "we were told it was classified." The rumor mill exploded after the 1993 salvage. Karsten Ray promoted theories of Nazi gold, looted art, even sensitive documents being smuggled out. The press ran with it. Headlines screamed about treasure U-boats and Nazi escape plans. Forensic analysis found none of that. What was there were the fuel drums, the music, the annotated charts, and signs that the submarine had been prepared for something other than standard combat operations. No gold, no art, no crates of valuables. But the modifications, the extra fuel, the storage containers, speak to a boat configured for a mission that wasn't on any official roster. The route, north toward Scandinavia, possibly aiming for neutral Sweden, or even further toward Norway's remote fjords, fits the profile of an evacuation or relocation run. In the final weeks of the war, some U-boats were repurposed to move personnel and materials out of Germany. U-530 and U-977 both reached Argentina in July and August 1945, surrendering months after the war ended. Their crews were interrogated and eventually released. The boats were seized by Argentine authorities. U-534 didn't make it anywhere. But the modifications, the fuel, the lack of scuttling, these are the signatures of a boat that intended to keep running. The fuel drums alone would have extended the boat's range by thousands of miles. Norway's fjords, still partially under German control in early May, could have served as a staging area. The routes marked on the charts could have been contingencies to avoid Allied patrols. The documents recovered from the officers' quarters included fragmentary logs and charts, some with annotations that remain unexplained. To this day, portions of those documents raise questions about the boat's final mission parameters. U-534 is now a museum exhibit in Birkenhead, England, cut into sections so visitors can walk through the pressure hull and see exactly what a Type 1C40 looked like inside. A restoration project launched in 2022 by Big Heritage continues to preserve and analyze the wreck. Corrosion patterns on the hull show the boat was hit by aerial depth charges on the aft section, causing catastrophic flooding in the engine room and stern compartments. The blast damage was localized, severe, and terminal. Once the stern flooded, the boat lost stability and went down. The diesel engines were still operational at the time of sinking. No evidence of mechanical failure. The engine room telegraph was set to full ahead, indicating the captain had ordered maximum speed just before the attack. The periscope had been raised, standard procedure for high-speed surface running in shallow water. But it also made the boat visible from the air. Survivor accounts, cross-referenced with RAF bombing logs from the Imperial War Museum, confirm the attack occurred in the morning on May 5, 1945. RAF Liberator aircraft from Coastal Command were conducting anti-submarine patrols in the Kattegat as part of the ongoing effort to prevent U-boats from escaping north. The pilot's after-action report describes a surfaced U-boat traveling at high speed, course approximately northward. The boat was engaged before it could reach safety. Depth charges were released. The report notes a definite sinking with debris and oil slick observed. U-534 was traveling at high surface speed in shallow waters where diving wasn't possible. The crew was making a run for Swedish territorial waters approximately 20 to 25 nautical miles away. At 18 knots, they needed over an hour. If they'd reached Swedish waters before being attacked, international law would have required Sweden to intern the boat and crew, preventing Allied capture. That's a very different endgame than scuttling or fighting to the death. But they didn't make it. The wreck is protected as a historical site. When the salvage team brought the submarine to the surface, remains of the 3 crew members who died were handled with respect. The site and recovered vessel are preserved for historical study and public education. You can see the torpedoes, the records, the personal effects. You can walk through the cramped crew quarters, see the tiny bunks stacked 3 high, smell the preserved diesel fuel still faintly present in the engine room. You can read the salvage reports and examine the restored documents. Museum displays explain the boat's specifications, its combat history, the circumstances of its sinking. But the mission logs, if they were ever complete, remain fragmentary. The captain's full records were never recovered intact. It's possible critical documents were destroyed in the flooding. It's also possible some materials were removed before the boat left keel. Standard procedure to prevent sensitive information from falling into Allied hands if the boat was captured. The recovered documents and charts contain annotations and route markings that don't align with standard combat patrol procedures. Researchers continue to study them. But key questions remain unanswered. Why the extra fuel? Why the northern route through shallow waters? Why the modifications done in haste just before departure? U-534 didn't surrender, didn't scuttle, and took its final orders to the bottom. What those orders were, that's another story.